What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to week 16 of the Axial Honcho budget build, the final week of the regular Honcho build as we know it. This has been an absolutely fantastic series. I've loved doing it and the response has been great. Now, while this is the last regular Honcho budget build episode, Matt and I are both going to be doing live streams tonight, Wednesday, the day that this video is posted. And you'll be able to find that information in the description below. Those videos will also be hosted on YouTube after the fact from the live stream in case you can't watch them live. Right now, we're looking around 9 p.m. Eastern time, which is 6 p.m. Pacific time. So depending on where you're at on the continent or in the world, find out how that correlates to you if you're interested in making it to the live video. I believe Matt's gonna go first. He'll probably be around that 9 o'clock time. I'll probably be somewhere around about an hour later. This week, I'm gonna wrap up the build with a couple of new upgrades. The first one is we're going to replace the plastic transmission gears that came in this Honcho with a fully machined set of Incision transmission gears. Now, there is some people who bought the Honcho in early 2018, maybe the first few months maybe, that got some metal gears in their transmission, but that was not the norm. It is a kind of a rare deal, and some of you just got lucky. But if you're like me and you got this Honcho and it had the plastic transmission gears, it is a good idea to get those replaced. I put a lot of miles on this Honcho and the plastic gears have held up fine so far, but the idler gear is always known to go out in an axial 3-gear transmission, and it's just something that you don't want to be stuck with on the trail one day. We're going to go with the Incision machined set. It replaces all 3 gears in the transmission and it's going to handle almost any power you could possibly throw at a Honcho. The second thing I'm going to show you is just kind of a bonus piece. This is a new skid plate from SMW, which is Superstition Machine Works, and this skid plate is very similar to the Delrin machined one that he used to produce but doesn't anymore. This one has angled link pockets to help straighten up those lower links and get them pointed directly at the lower link mounts at the axle. Has a nice smooth bottom. There's no lips or ridges or anything like that. Just gives you a super nice smooth transition all over that skid plate. This is just kind of a cool piece and I wanted to show you guys some options of things that were out there. So let's jump into the install and tackle these two things first. First thing I'm going to do is disconnect the bullet connectors from the motor. Then I'm going to disconnect the front and rear drive shafts. Once all of that is disconnected, we're going to remove the 4 screws from the bottom of the transmission. With this new molded version of the transmission, all 4 of the screws that attach the transmission to the skid plate are the same length. With all 4 of the screws out, the transmission will come right out of the top of the car. With the transmission out, the first thing I'm going to do is remove the spur and slipper assembly. Then we're going to remove the 4 screws holding the 2 case halves together. With all the screws removed, you can now split the 2 halves of the transmission case. We need to remove all 3 of the bearings and shafts from the transmission. The 2 lower gears in this transmission are plastic, and that's our major concern. The top gear in this transmission is metal, but it's a sintered metal, and sintered metal is not the strongest type of material, so these top gears can still explode. Now, you can just buy metal gears in the other 2, but if you want to get the strongest transmission you possibly can, you need to replace all 3 gears with a machined gear set. So for this top gear, we need to remove the 1.5mm pin and set that aside, and then slide off that sintered top gear. Before we reinstall the new top gear, we can notice that there is some distinct wear marks where the bearings ride on this transmission. That's not something that I would say maybe I typically notice on one of my RCs, and it's something that I may want to address somehow in the future if I look further into what's causing that. Reinstall the pin into the top shaft, reinstall that top shaft and top gear into the case, and then make sure that you give it a nice firm press to make sure that that pin fully seats into that gear. You need to make sure that the pin is all the way in and below flush with the backside of that gear. Now, to replace the idler gear, all we need is that gear pin. The 2 bearings that are in this idler gear we're not going to use. These are 5x10 bearings, and the new Incision idler gear actually uses 5x11 bearings, and these 2 bearings are included in the package. So all we need to do is press these bearings into the gear and then place the idler gear pin through that idler gear and put that whole assembly back into the transmission case. Now for the final gear, remove the bearing from the outputs and then remove the 3 screws holding the outputs onto the final gear. Now we can remove the outputs from that plastic final gear. Something to note is that these 3 screws that hold the outputs onto that ring gear are a specialty screw. They have a smaller head than a typical 2mm screw would have. So for most gear sets, you need to make sure that you hold onto these and reuse these screws specifically. However, with the Incision gear set, there's actually reliefs made around the outside of the gear where they bolt together, and a more standard M2 screw is included with the gear. These are a grade 12.9 screw, which is going to be quite a bit stronger than the screws that were included with your stock Honcho. To reinstall these, simply line up the screws on the outputs with the holes in that final gear. During reinstallation of these screws, make sure to use some Loctite on all 3 of the screws. It is not uncommon for these 3 screws to become loose and tear up your transmission case or completely bind up your transmission. With all 3 screws cinched down tight, we can now reinstall the bearings onto those outputs. As a last step before we install the final gear into the transmission, I'm going to put a light coat of grease around the entire outside of this final gear. That should be enough grease to transfer to all 3 of the internal machined gears to make sure that they're properly lubricated. Now we can close up this transmission and get ready to put it back in the truck. We've got the transmission closed up now, but before I reinstall the spur gear, I'm gonna do one other little thing. If you've ever noticed, in the center of the axial spur gears, there is a little bushing. That's a 5x11mm bushing. Now, I don't know if it makes a big difference, but I like to replace that plastic bushing with a bearing. This is a standard 5x11x4 fast eddy bearing. I'm gonna put it into my spur gear and then put it back onto the transmission. You can see how that bearing rides right there in the center of the spur gear. Whether or not it makes a big difference, who knows? But I can't think of almost any other situation where I wouldn't rather have a bearing like this rather than a plastic bushing. Here's a closer look at that SMW 3D printed skid plate. You can see that the lower link pockets are angled so they point directly at the lower link mounts of the axle. These angled link pockets keep your rod ends centered as best as possible, giving you full freedom of motion from your links. This is just one more step you can take to help smooth out and free up your suspension, just to make sure that it works as best as possible. The bottom of this skid plate is just as smooth as possible, no lips or ridges or anything like that. Now, it is not a flat skid plate. It maintains the standard link drop that you see in a stock Axial SCX10 skid plate. Installation of this piece into the Honcho with my current setup basically means disassembling a very large portion of it, so I'm not going to go over the full installation of this skid plate tonight. But for all the info on this skid plate, you can check the links in the description. And those are the last upgrades we're gonna cover in the Honcho budget build. For those of you who have followed along and watched all of the episodes, I can't thank you enough. Thanks for all of the support, and I'm really happy with how this series turned out in the end. We made it 16 weeks without missing a single episode. I'm really proud of that, but more than anything, I'm super thankful that Matt at Scale Builders Guild came along for the ride as well. Now, as far as what's next for the Honcho, I think that I'm actually going to kind of leave it alone. I kicked around some ideas of throwing a bunch more stuff on it, but I think at this point, I'm just gonna call it good. I'm gonna leave it like it is. Hopefully Matt makes it down to Axial Fest with his, and we can run them just as they ended up in the series. Matt and I both have a ton of other projects still that we've got to get to soon, and I'm just going to leave this thing as it is, but I'm still gonna run it. Hopefully I'll find some time to do some more running videos of this thing as well, because I really do enjoy driving this truck. And as one budget series comes to an end, you will be seeing a new style of budget series coming from me in the upcoming weeks. This will be a completely new style for me, and you'll see some new faces make appearances on the channel with this new series as well. But with that, guys, one final time, let's say, thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the series. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, and it's been a great ride.